It's one of the most famous stories in all of history, so much so that it even spawned its own genre of malware. But was it true? Did the Trojans really bring down their city by taking in a giant wooden horse, only to have their entire civilization wiped out by Greek invaders? Well, like all good historical tales, there are grains of truth mixed in with an awful lot of mythology. So let's unpack the history of the Trojan War, which we know was fought, but which we don't know was quite like how it's traditionally been told for millennia. To understand the story, we first need to meet the people. Who were the Trojans, and where did they come from? The short answer is no one is 100% certain, but the slightly longer answer is that scholars believe they may have originated in what is now the country of Bulgaria. See, modern historians generally agree that there was indeed a Bronze Age civilization known as the Mycenaeans located on the southern coast of Greece, and this civilization included several independent city-states, including Mycenae, Sparta, and Pylos. And archaeologists have found evidence of a Mycenaean city in the form of the ruins of a citadel called Hisarlik, near the modern Turkish city of Çanakkale, which is also near the site of the modern-day Gallipoli Peninsula, which, if you haven't already noticed, is right across the Aegean Sea from mainland Greece. So it seems plausible that a group of seafaring Mycenaeans could have settled here and established their own trading colony, which would eventually grow into a significant city by the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BC. It had become a major center of trade and had developed its own culture and language. But just like the Egyptians, the Mycenaeans kept written records on papyrus, which unfortunately breaks down after just a few years. So despite the fact that Linear B, the script used by the Mycenaeans, has been deciphered, we still don't have any contemporary written records from Troy itself. So we don't know what they called themselves. The name Troy comes from the Greek word for city, polis, and is simply how the Greeks referred to the people who lived there, just like how the Romans referred to the inhabitants of Troy as Trojans. So who were the Trojans at war with? Here is where things get a bit hazy because, according to Homer, the main protagonist of the Trojan War is a guy named Paris. Now, Paris was the son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba, the rulers of Troy, and he was kind of a jackass. You see, in Homer's Iliad, the story kicks off with Paris being tasked by his father to go and judge a beauty contest between three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Each goddess was offering him an amazing prize. Athena promised wisdom and power, while Hera promised wealth and power. But Aphrodite offered him Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world. And she wasn't lying. Helen really was drop-dead gorgeous. But there was just one teensy problem. Helen was already married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta. But Paris liked the odds, so he took Aphrodite up on her offer. Then, when Menelaus found out, he got all the Greek city-states together and formed an alliance to reclaim his wife. And so the Greeks set sail for Troy, kicked off the decade-long war that made Paris and his fellow Trojans sweat. But again, who exactly were these Greeks? Well, since the Mycenaean Greeks didn't leave behind any written records detailing their wars, it's difficult to say. Again, if Homer's Iliad is to be believed, then we can safely assume that the Mycenaean kingdoms of the Peloponnese took part in the war against Troy. But whether or not other city-states were involved is unknown. But recent discoveries may have given us some answers. For example, in the 1930s, a team of archaeologists uncovered the ruins of a citadel in the central Anatolian plain about 160 miles from Troy. They identified it as the biblical city of Hisar and argued that it was the Hittite capital of Wilusa, which, according to Hittite texts, was regularly at war with the Ahiyawa, a mysterious people whom many scholars believe were the Mycenaeans. And excavations of another site in central Anatolia revealed a fortress city that archaeologists identified as the ancient city of Zile, which, according to Hittite texts, was sacked by the Ahiyawa in the 13th century BC. So we do have evidence that the Mycenaeans definitely went on some sort of Anatolian campaign during this time period. But whether or not it was the 10-year siege of Troy is anyone's guess. In fact, it's quite possible that there never was a 10-year siege of Troy. Instead, there may have been multiple engagements over several decades, if not centuries. In fact, in the 1870s, a Russian archaeologist uncovered a human skull in Troy that turned out to be at least 400 years older than the Bronze Age. This led him to hypothesize that there may have been earlier settlements on the site before the Bronze Age, meaning there could have been several conflicts between the Mycenaeans and the native peoples of the region. Also, back in 2019, scientists used computer modeling to try and figure out if a 10-year siege of Troy was logistically feasible, and their conclusion was a pretty decisive no. According to their model, the Mycenaeans couldn't have supplied enough food to sustain their army without outside help, which means either the Mycenaeans were resupplied by boat every year, which would have been extremely dangerous due to the rough seas in the Aegean during the Bronze Age, or the war dragged on for longer than a decade. Of course, all of this is speculation based on incomplete archaeological evidence. So the real question is, how do we know that any of this even happened? Well, if the archaeological record doesn't provide any direct evidence of the Trojan War, there is one source that may have invaluable insight into the origins of the tale: the Hittites. As we mentioned earlier, the Hittite Empire was centered in what is now Turkey and parts of Syria. And they were the first Anatolian kingdom to master the art of war, inventing such innovations as chariots and iron weapons. And unlike their neighbors, the Hittites kept meticulous records. Everything we know about their civilization comes from clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped cuneiform script. And those records show that they were constantly at war with the Casca, a mysterious group of people living somewhere to the west. Scholars have long believed that the Casca were the ancestors of the Trojans, and recent research suggests that the Casca may have actually been a confederation of local city-states, including, yes, Troy. If true, this would explain why the Hittite records mention nothing about a city called Troy, and it would also help to explain why Homer describes the Trojans as being blonde and blue-eyed. See, the Kassites were known to have light complexions, which likely came from their Caucasian and Iranian ancestors, and Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, noted that the Trojans were an Iranian people. If you think this story is fascinating, then you should definitely check out the series Troy, Fall of a City. It follows the legendary tale of the Trojan War from both the Greek and Trojan perspectives, bringing the epic poem to life through the eyes of characters both great and small. But what about the Greeks? Did they exist? Well, turns out that they also kept written records, but instead of clay tablets, they preferred to write on papyrus, which, as we said earlier, breaks down after just a few years. However, thanks to a brilliant piece of detective work by a guy named John T.L. Tuogay-Lay, we have managed to decipher some of these ancient scripts. The first was Linear A, used by the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete, which we decoded in the early 1950s. But Linear B, used by the Mycenaean civilization, remained a mystery until 1952, when Michael Ventris and John Chadwick successfully cracked it. With Linear B, we learned that the Mycenaeans had their own version of the Trojan War, and in it, the Mycenaeans weren't called Achaeans, but rather Danaans, while the Trojans weren't called Trojans, but Argives. And instead of Paris being the one who started the war, it was the Danaans who attacked the Argives, presumably because the Mycenaeans considered themselves to be descendants of a mythical ancestor named Danaus, who ruled over Argos before moving to Mycenae. And it turns out that Linear B also mentions another important detail, namely that the Mycenaean kings believed that their victory over the Argives was prophesied to last for 10 generations, which works out to roughly 400 years. And while historians debate the accuracy of that prophecy, what's not up for debate is that the Mycenaean civilization collapsed sometime around 1100 BC. So clearly something happened in or around 1200 BC that caused the collapse of both the Mycenaean and late Bronze Age civilizations across the Mediterranean. But whatever it was, scholars have found no evidence that it had anything to do with a devastating 10-year war. So was the Trojan War a myth? Well, no. We know for a fact that the Mycenaeans went on campaigns to Anatolia, but we don't know if they conquered a city called Troy. And if they did, it probably wasn't nearly as glorious as Homer described. The idea of a 10-year siege is almost certainly a myth, and the whole story of Paris abducting Helen and starting a war between two great civilizations is almost certainly a complete fabrication. But perhaps the most tragic part of this entire story isn't that the details of the war were lost to time, but rather that the civilization that may have inspired Homer's epic poem was all but forgotten. Troy is available on DVD and Blu-ray now, and you can get it for 35% off on our website by clicking the link in the description below. Thanks for watching.